Welcome to Kiss and Chapters, where every story begins with a spark and ends with a swoon. If you love heart-fluttering romances, unexpected twists, and characters you'll root for, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so I can keep bringing you more sweet, emotional, and unforgettable stories. Let's fall in love with every chapter, together. Chapter 1. The Wedding That Wasn't Supposed to Happen. Frances jolted awake, gasping for breath. Silk sheets tangled around her legs, a heavy canopy draped overhead, and the scent of lavender lingering in the air. This was not her apartment in the city. This was not even her world. She sat up slowly, the corset digging into her ribs as her hands trembled. A mirror across the room reflected an unfamiliar yet elegant figure. Auburn curls, pale skin, and a pair of wide, shocked green eyes. "Lady Frances Windfall," she whispered, horror blooming in her chest. She had read this novel. More accurately, she had raged her way through the chapters. The villainous noblewoman Frances Windfall was an arrogant, spoiled daughter of a disgraced family. She was arranged to marry Grand Duke Walter Draven, the most feared man in the Empire, only to be cast aside after 3 days, humiliated and alone. Then she vanished from the story. "I'm her," she croaked. "I'm the villain's doomed bride." A knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. A maid entered, curtsying with robotic grace. "My lady, the ceremony begins in an hour. Lady Eileen has requested you begin dressing." Frances blinked. "Ceremony? No. This was the day of the wedding." Her limbs moved automatically as she was bathed, perfumed, and dressed in an elaborate ivory gown. She was still in shock, but fragments of memory, her memories and Frances's, were starting to merge. The real Frances had been furious about this political marriage. In the original plot, she'd insulted the Grand Duke at the altar. "Nope," the new Frances muttered, holding still as jeweled pins were secured in her hair. "Not doing that. No death flags today." When she was ready, she was ushered into a grand carriage, her reflection staring back at her from polished glass. She didn't recognize herself, but she squared her shoulders. If she had to live in this world, she would survive it. The cathedral was majestic, soaring spires, marble steps, and rows of nobility watching her every move. Her heels clicked down the aisle as the music swelled. At the far end stood a tall man in black. Walter Draven. He was more striking than the book had described. Raven hair, sharp jaw, and pale eyes the color of steel. He looked down at her as she approached, face unreadable. When they stood before the priest, Frances managed a small nod. Walter didn't smile. He barely acknowledged her. "I do," she said clearly when prompted, holding his gaze. He hesitated, then replied, "I do." They exchanged rings. A kiss was thankfully skipped. And then it was done. Duke Walter Draven was now her husband. The ride back to the Grand Duke's estate was silent. Frances sat stiffly, hands clasped in her lap, while Walter read a file with disinterest. "Thank you for not causing a scene," he said finally without looking at her. "You're welcome," she replied. "I figured I'd try something new today. Like not ruining my life." That made him glance up, eyes narrowing. "I was told you were volatile." She smiled sweetly. "People change." His frown deepened, but he said nothing. When they arrived at the estate, larger than any castle she'd ever imagined, Walter escorted her only as far as the main hall. "Your wing is to the east. We won't be sharing quarters." "Understood. You'll have staff. Rules will be sent in writing." "Great." He finally met her gaze, lingering there for a moment. "This will be over in 3 days, Lady Frances. I expect you to behave accordingly." She didn't flinch. "And if I don't want it to be over?" That gave him pause. "What game are you playing?" "No game." She gave him a half curtsy. "Just thinking of rewriting the ending." And with that, Frances Windfall, bride of the villain, trespasser in a world not her own, turned and walked into her new life, determined to win the story. Chapter 2. 3 Days to Doom. Frances paced back and forth in her new chambers, her wedding gown long discarded in favor of a soft lavender nightdress. The moment the door closed behind her, she had collapsed onto the chaise, overwhelmed. But now adrenaline replaced shock. She needed a plan. 3 days, she muttered. He divorces me in 3 days. It was the first major plot point in the novel. After the politically motivated wedding, Walter would hand Francis the annulment papers. It was done with ice in his voice and a look that could kill. The book had painted him as a cold, calculating villain with no use for a wife, especially not one from a family as corrupt as the Windfalls. But Francis knew better now. She'd met the man, and while cold and guarded, he hadn't been cruel. He was emotionally detached, distant, suspicious of her every word. That was a different kind of danger. She sat down at the vanity, staring at her reflection. The face was still unfamiliar. But the fire in her eyes? That was all her. "All right, Francis," she said to herself. "If we want to stay alive and undivorced, we need to act fast." She grabbed the nearest piece of parchment and began scribbling. Operation Survive the Villain. 1. Do not act like the original Francis. No tantrums, no insults. 2. Gain the staff's trust. They report everything. 3. Prove usefulness to Walter. Appeal to logic, not emotions. 4. Avoid the heroine. At all cost. 5. Make Walter curious. If he's intrigued, he won't kick me out. Easy, she sighed. Right. The next morning, Francis woke before the sun. She dressed plainly in a soft blue gown and asked her maid Mina to show her around. Mina, a quiet girl with big eyes and a timid voice, seemed wary at first. But Francis made it a point to speak gently, thank her for everything, and even carried her own shawl. "Lady Francis," Mina whispered, clearly confused, "you're different today." Francis grinned. "Is that a bad thing?" "No, my lady. It's refreshing." They toured the East Wing, and Francis paid attention, taking note of servant schedules, hidden passages, and the layout of the estate. She offered kind words to every staff member she passed. A few looked suspicious. Most looked stunned. By the time breakfast rolled around, she had memorized 10 names and helped carry bread to the kitchen. She strolled into the dining hall with a carefully prepared smile, and nearly bumped into Walter. He raised an eyebrow. "You're up early." "Habit," she lied. "I didn't expect you to come to breakfast." She gestured toward the long table. "Well, I thought I'd make a good impression." "Is that allowed, Your Grace?" His eyes narrowed slightly, but he gave a curt nod and sat. Francis followed. The silence was thick. She reached for a roll, buttered it, and took a bite. Then she glanced up at him. "You always read during meals?" "It keeps things quiet," he replied. "Well, don't let me disturb your peace." More silence. But Walter didn't leave. Later that day, Francis found herself in the library. She scoured the shelves for books about noble etiquette, history, and imperial politics. If she was going to survive in this world, she needed more than sass. She didn't notice Walter enter until he cleared his throat. "You read?" he said, surprised. "Should I not?" she replied without looking up. He stepped closer. "I thought you were more interested in parties." "I was." Francis set the book down. "But lately I've been rethinking who I want to be." Walter studied her carefully. "What are you playing at?" "Nothing. Just trying not to be terrible." A flicker of something passed through his eyes. Doubt? Curiosity? "You'll find it's not that simple in this household." "I've noticed." And with that he walked away. Francis smiled to herself. Step 4: make him curious. Check. That night, Francis wrote in her notebook again. Progress report. Staff, confused but receptive. Walter, still cold but not hostile. Me, alive, undivorced. 1 day down. 2 more to go, she whispered, capping her pen. Let's keep rewriting. Chapter 3, Breakfast with a Villain. The second morning of Francis's new life began with the smell of warm bread and honeyed butter. She followed the scent down the corridor in her slippers, having slipped away from her room before Mina could fuss over her outfit. For once, she didn't want to dress like a duchess, just a girl from another world who desperately needed a peaceful breakfast. When she reached the kitchen, the staff froze mid-task. A footman dropped a tray. The cook's eyes widened in horror. "Pie lady," gasped Mina, arriving breathless behind her. "This isn't proper." Francis smiled brightly. "I'm hungry. And I figured food tastes better when you earn it." She rolled up her sleeves and helped carry a basket of freshly baked loaves to the servants' table, ignoring the stunned silence. "Do you like pancakes?" she asked one of the younger maids. The girl nodded quickly and Francis grinned. "Great. Let's see if I can bribe the cook." It wasn't long before laughter began to bubble from the staff as Frances flipped pancakes with surprising confidence. Her movements were clumsy at times, but sincere, and by the time she sat down to eat with a few of the braver maids, the atmosphere had changed from tense to oddly warm. She was halfway through her second stack when a chill entered the room. Walter stood in the doorway. All conversation stopped. Frances swallowed slowly then smiled. "Good morning, Your Grace." He said nothing for a long moment, his eyes sweeping over the scene. The Duchess seated at the servants' table laughing over pancakes, sleeves rolled up like a scullery maid. Then he spoke. "Are you lost?" "Nope." She gestured to the plate in front of her. "Just hungry." Walter's gaze darkened. "This isn't where you're supposed to be." Frances stood and dusted off her hands. "I thought I'd start my day with actual people." He took a step closer. "You think this makes you endearing?" She held his gaze. "I think this makes me real." A long silence passed between them. Finally Walter turned to the staff. "Leave us." They scattered. Frances crossed her arms. "You don't need to bark at them. They didn't do anything wrong. I'm not concerned with them. I'm concerned with you. I'm not planning a coup. I'm eating pancakes." Walter's lips twitched. "Just slightly. You're unlike any noblewoman I've ever met." "I'll take that as a compliment." "I didn't say it was." She took a deep breath. "Walter, can I ask something?" "Why the 3-day rule?" He stiffened. "It's none of your concern." "But it is. I'm the one being discarded." His eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Because it's easier to end things quickly. No attachments. No regrets." "And yet," she said gently, "you married me." "That was politics." "Then why not just annul it in private? Why wait 3 days?" Walter turned away. "Because I always give people a chance to prove me wrong." Frances blinked. "That wasn't in the novel." "Then let me try," she said quietly. He looked over his shoulder. "Why do you care?" "Because I want to stay alive." "Maybe. I think there's more to you than what the world sees." For a moment he didn't answer. Then he walked away. But he didn't dismiss her. Later that day Frances returned to her wing to find a small note on her pillow. "Dinner tonight. Formal. No pancakes. W." She burst out laughing. Progress. Chapter 4. A Deal with the Devil. Dinner was held in a smaller, private dining room rather than the grand hall. Frances arrived early, dressed in a soft burgundy gown that flattered her figure without being ostentatious. She had braided her hair into a crown, simple but elegant. If she was going to negotiate with a villain, she wanted to look the part of a reasonable and composed duchess. Walter entered precisely on time. As usual, he wore all black, sharp lines, dark collar, not a speck of dust. The contrast between his attire and his pale features only added to the aura of danger around him. "You came prepared," he said, taking in her appearance. "You asked for formal," she replied. "I follow instructions." He took his seat at the head of the table and she was guided to the seat at his right. Servants brought in courses: roasted pheasant, glazed carrots, sweet wine. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Frances cleared her throat. "I have a proposal." Walter looked at her sharply. "Go on." "I know we're set to divorce in, what, a day and a half now?" She sipped her wine. "But I'd like to extend that deadline." His eyes narrowed. "Why?" "1 month. Let me stay for 1 month." "What game are you playing?" "No game. Just, I think I can be useful. I know your household is under scrutiny. You have enemies in the court. A scandal, like a failed marriage, would be fuel to their fire." Walter leaned back, arms crossed. "And you think you can help me avoid scandal?" Frances nodded. "Yes. I'll follow your rules. I won't start any trouble. I'll play the part of the Grand Duchess quietly and competently. In exchange, you delay the annulment." He studied her, expression unreadable. "No seduction?" he asked. She almost choked on her wine. "Definitely not. I'm proposing an arrangement, not a love story." "Good. Because my heart isn't on the table." Frances met his gaze evenly. "Nor is mine." Another pause. Then, "Interesting." Walter looked at his wineglass. 1 month. You stay out of my way. No scandals, no surprises. If you become a problem, I end it early." "Agreed." He nodded once. Then we have a deal. Francis smiled. A deal with the devil. How poetic. Walter raised his glass. To 30 days of peace, then. They clinked glasses. Francis wasn't sure who had just won this negotiation. But at least now she had time. Time to learn. Time to adapt. Time to change the ending. Later that night, back in her room, she opened her notebook. New plan. Operation Infiltrate the Iceberg. Avoid the heroine. Study Walter's routine. Gain allies among staff. Learn estate management. Keep emotions out of this. Mina walked in and paused at the sight of her grinning mistress. You look triumphant, my lady. I made a deal, Francis said, closing her notebook. With a man who never makes deals. Should I be worried? Mina asked. Francis laughed. Absolutely. Chapter 5. The Masquerade Ball. The annual Blackmoor Masquerade was a spectacle of elegance, mystery, and ruthless gossip. Nobles from every corner of the empire gathered to whisper secrets behind velvet masks and dance beneath the light of gilded chandeliers. But this year, all eyes were on one woman, the new Duchess of Blackmoor. Frances stood before the tall mirror in her chambers, hardly recognizing the reflection staring back at her. Her gown, a deep midnight blue that shimmered like starlight, hugged her frame with just enough scandal to stir whispers but not outrage. A silver lace mask framed her eyes, and tiny sapphires dangled from her ears. You look stunning, my lady, her maid whispered in awe. Frances took a steadying breath. Let's hope my husband thinks so. Walter stood by the grand staircase, speaking quietly with a military officer. He wore a black formal coat lined with silver embroidery, his mask raven black with sharp angles that accentuated his already intimidating presence. As Francis descended the stairs, the murmurs in the crowd rose like waves. He felt every gaze, every judgment, and ignored them all. Her focus was solely on the man waiting at the bottom. Walter turned. His gaze locked with hers. For a fleeting second he didn't move. Didn't speak. Just stared. Frances smiled. Care to dance, Your Grace? She asked once she reached him. He inclined his head, offering his arm. You're full of surprises. Get used to it. They stepped onto the ballroom floor, joining the dance as the orchestra began a slow waltz. Around them, nobles whispered behind fans and masks, eyes wide with disbelief. Walter's hand settled on her waist, his other holding hers. Their steps matched in perfect synchrony. You've caused quite a stir, he murmured. That's the idea. Let them talk. His jaw ticked. You enjoy games. She leaned in slightly. Only the ones worth winning. For a moment the tension between them was electric. His grip tightened just slightly, his voice lowering. What exactly are you trying to win, Francis? She tilted her head, lips curling. Maybe your trust. Maybe your heart. Or maybe I just enjoy being unpredictable. He stared at her through the mask, something unreadable in his gaze. You're not like the woman I expected. Good. She got divorced in 3 days. The dance ended, but the buzz around the Duchess had only begun. Courtiers flocked to her, offering compliments laced with suspicion. Frances played her role well, gracious, poised, impossible to ignore. When Walter returned to her side with 2 glasses of wine, she blinked in surprise. A peace offering? She asked. An observation, he said, handing her one. You handle a room better than most generals handle a battlefield. I'll take that as a compliment. Take it as a warning, he replied, though his tone lacked its usual edge. They moved to the edge of the ballroom, watching the dancers swirl past. You're not just surviving here, he said quietly. You're thriving. I don't intend to be cast aside, Walter, she said, her voice soft but steady. This world may see me as a villainess, but I'm rewriting the story. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, You're either the cleverest woman I've ever met, or the most foolish. Can't I be both? That earned the smallest twitch of a smirk at the corner of his mouth. Later that evening, as the ball reached its peak and the chandeliers cast golden light over tired dancers and spilled champagne, Walter escorted Frances back to her chambers. Outside her door they paused. You made quite an impression tonight, he said. Good, she whispered. Did I impress you? His gaze darkened, unreadable once more. You confuse me. Better than boring you. She leaned in, standing on tiptoe, and gently pressed a kiss to his cheek. Good night, Your Grace. Then she stepped inside and closed the door, heart pounding. Walter stood alone in the hallway, staring at the door for a long moment. He didn't walk away. Chapter 6. A Villain's Past. The East Wing was strictly off-limits. Everyone in the Blackmore estate knew that. Servants avoided it like the plague. Even the guards stationed nearby never lingered longer than necessary. They said it was haunted, cursed. Some claimed that was where the old Duke had died. Others whispered of something even darker. But Frances had never been one to follow rules blindly, especially not ones that kept her from understanding the man she'd married. And Walter? He was a fortress. Cold, unreadable, unyielding. He wanted to understand what had built those walls. So she waited until the servants were preoccupied and Walter had gone to the training yard, then slipped down the hall in soft slippers, heart thudding with each step. The corridor was dim, dust motes dancing in the slants of late afternoon sun. Doors lined the hall, many sealed shut, their handles tarnished with time. But one door stood slightly ajar as if someone had forgotten to close it. Frances pushed it open. It was a study, old and forgotten but oddly preserved. Papers were stacked neatly on a heavy oak desk. A faded map of the kingdom hung on one wall, marked with pins and scribbles she didn't understand. A broken sword lay across the mantel and beside it a cracked porcelain vase. But what made her breath hitch was the portrait. A woman regal and gentle with soft features and intelligent eyes. She looked nothing like Walter, but there was something in her expression, something resolute and steady, that reminded Frances of him. There was no nameplate. Just silence. She stepped closer, reaching to brush dust from the corner of the frame. "You're not supposed to be here." Frances froze. The voice came from the doorway. "Oh, come." And unmistakably Walter. She turned slowly. "I didn't mean to pry," she said. "I was just curious." He didn't step in. Didn't move. His gaze was unreadable as always, but there was something else. Something quieter, lingering behind it. "You think you'll find answers in here?" he asked. "I think there are things you won't say," she replied honestly. "But maybe you've left traces of them behind." A long silence followed. Finally Walter stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind him. He walked past her and stood before the portrait. "She was my mother." Frances nodded, sensing that he didn't often speak of her. "She died when I was 10, Walter continued, voice soft. "Poisoned, they said. But no one was ever punished. My father remarried 2 months later. My stepmother moved in and took over everything. This room was the only part of the house she never touched." Frances listened, heart aching. "She hated me," he said simply. "Said I was too quiet, too cold. My father stopped speaking to me altogether. I was sent to the northern border when I was 14. Told to earn my name in battle or die forgotten." "You were a child," Frances whispered. He laughed bitterly. No one cared. Silence fell again. Frances walked to the broken sword on the mantel. "Is this yours?" Walter nodded. "My first blade. Snapped it in half, saving a commander who later betrayed me to the court." Frances turned to face him. "Why keep it?" "To remind me," he said. "That trust is a luxury." She walked toward him slowly. "Do you trust me?" He didn't answer at first. Just looked at her with that guarded expression she knew too well. Then he said, "I don't know. But I want to." Her heart clenched. "Walter," she said gently, "I know I'm not from here. And I know this marriage started out as a farce in your eyes. But I meant it when I said I wouldn't run. I want to stay, not just in the estate but with you. If you'll let me." His eyes searched hers. Then without warning he reached out and took her hand. His fingers were warm, rough with calluses. "I don't know how to be a husband," he admitted. "I was never taught. I only learned how to fight. How to survive. I don't know what you want from me." "I want you to let me in," she said softly. "That's all." A long moment passed. Then Walter said, "Come with me." She blinked. "Now." He nodded and led her out of the study, down the corridor, and into a stairwell that spiraled upward into a turret she'd never explored. At the top was a small tower room with a domed ceiling and glass windows on all sides. Dusty furniture was covered in cloth, but when Walter pulled back one curtain, light streamed in, revealing a breathtaking view of the valley. "This was her favorite place," he said. My mother used to bring me here and tell me stories about the stars. She said even in the darkest nights, they remind us that light still exists somewhere. Francis walked to the window. It's beautiful. I haven't been up here since she died, he said quietly. But I remembered the way. She turned and looked at him. This time he wasn't armored. He looked tired. And young. And deeply human. She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him. At first he didn't move. Then slowly his arms came around her too, stiff at first then gradually tightening. Thank you for showing me, she murmured. Walter rested his chin atop her head. Thank you for staying. That night Walter didn't return to his own chambers. He stayed with her. And though they didn't kiss, didn't undress, didn't do anything beyond lie beneath the same blanket, Francis felt something between them shift. Walls cracked. Shadows softened. And in the heart of a villain, something warm finally took root. Chapter 7. The Garden He Never Entered. Francis woke to the scent of lavender and roses. It took her a moment to realize it wasn't a dream. The windows were open and the morning breeze carried the fragrance of blooming flowers. She had asked the maids to open the West Wing garden for her days ago, but it had always remained locked. Forgotten. Sealed off like so many things in Walter's world. But today the gates were open. She dressed quickly and followed the winding path past the hedge maze, past the ancient statue of the founder of Blackmoor, until she reached it. A small enclosed garden that had been overtaken by wild roses and ivy. Vines crawled along stone benches. A broken swing hung from an old tree. And there, standing amidst it all, was Walter. He turned when he heard her steps, his expression unreadable as always. But he didn't leave. This place, Francis said gently, stepping closer, it's beautiful. It used to be, Walter replied. Before it turned into a graveyard. Francis hesitated. Someone died here? He shook his head. No. But everything good in me did. She walked up beside him, silent. My mother planted this garden, he said after a while. Every weekend, rain or shine. She used to say the roses only bloomed for people who believed in second chances. Francis glanced around. There were buds everywhere, some half open, some full and radiant. She must have believed in you, Francis murmured. Walter let out a breath. I haven't set foot here since the day she died. Francis gently took his hand. And yet here you are. He looked at her, eyes softening. You opened something in me, Francis. I don't know what to do with it. Let it grow, she whispered. Like the roses. They stood there in silence for a while, hands clasped, surrounded by the quiet rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. A peace neither of them knew they craved settled over them. Then Walter asked, if you had never woken up in this world, what do you think your life would have been like? Francis blinked, surprised by the question. Probably boring. Predictable. Safe. And do you miss it? She looked up at him. No. Because I never had anything that made me feel this alive. He lowered his head and for a moment Francis thought he would kiss her. But he just brushed her cheek with his thumb and said, then maybe I'll stop fearing tomorrow. For the record, Francis said, smiling, I think your mother was right. About second chances. Walter's eyes gleamed. Then perhaps, this villain might get one after all. Chapter 8. The Duke's Ultimatum. The sun had barely risen when a royal carriage arrived at the gates of Blackmoor. Francis watched from the balcony as liveried servants stepped aside, and out came a tall, imposing man clad in regal navy and silver. The Duke of Avingale, Walter's uncle and the man who held influence over nearly every noble house in the kingdom. He hadn't come for a friendly visit. By the time Walter joined her, his expression was already hardening. He wants an audience. With both of us. Francis met his gaze. Then let's give him one. The atmosphere in the great hall was thick with tension. The Duke stood near the hearth like he owned the place, fingers tapping his cane, eyes cool and calculating. Well, he said, not bothering to greet them. It seems congratulations are in order. I've heard quite a bit about your lively little Duchess. Francis kept her posture straight and smile polite. Thank you, Your Grace. The Duke's eyes slid to Walter. Nephew. I thought I made myself clear after your last scandal. You were to keep your affairs quiet. Marrying a woman with no standing, no history and no use to our allies? That's not just reckless, it's dangerous. Walter didn't flinch. Frances is my wife. That's all that should matter. Oh, but it does matter, the Duke said coldly. Because you have responsibilities, titles, and debts of loyalty to this family. The Queen is watching and so are your enemies. A single crack in your household invites collapse. Frances stepped forward. With all due respect, I may not have noble blood, but I'm not a liability. The Duke turned to her with an arched brow. Aren't you? You've rewritten gossip, stirred public curiosity, and charmed half the capital. And yet no lineage. No dowry. No proof of who you really are. Frances' heart beat faster, but she kept her voice steady. Then let me give you proof. She walked across the room and took Walter's hand, intertwining their fingers. I'm the one who stayed when everyone else left. I'm the one who listened to his silence, learned his scars, and still chose him. I'm the only one who sees the man behind the name. That's more loyalty than any contract can buy. Walter squeezed her hand. The Duke's expression faltered, just for a breath. You speak boldly, girl. Frances tilted her head. Maybe because I believe in bold love. There was a long pause. Then the Duke chuckled. Very well. If you're so certain, prove it. Walter narrowed his eyes. What are you suggesting? A ball. 1 week from today. Host it here. Invite the court. Show them that your bride belongs among us. The Duke's smile turned sharp. If she succeeds, I'll formally recognize the marriage. If he fails, I'll push for annulment before the king himself. Frances froze. Yes. In front of the nobility. She didn't know the customs, the dances, the rules. But she looked at Walter. And he nodded. She'll do it, he said, voice calm. And she'll win. The Duke bowed slightly. We shall see. That night, Frances lay awake, heart pounding. Walter sat beside her on the bed, silent. You don't have to go through with it, he said quietly. She looked at him. Yes, I do. If I back down now, I'll always be the girl who didn't belong. Walter hesitated, then whispered, Then let me help you win. She smiled. You? Teaching me how to survive a noble ball. I can teach you how to command a room, he said with a smirk. After all, I am the villain of this story. Frances laughed softly. Not to me. And as their fingers entwined under the covers, both of them understood something unspoken. The battle for their love had begun, but they would fight it together. Chapter 9. 1 week to win them all. The next 7 days became a whirlwind. Frances rose before dawn and collapsed long after midnight, her body aching from endless lessons in noble etiquette, royal customs, formal dances, and courtly greetings. Walter personally oversaw each session as if preparing a general for battle. Keep your chin up, shoulders back. You're not a girl trying to impress them. You're a duchess. Own the room. She mimicked his stance. Easier said than done when I'm terrified of spilling wine on a viscount's lap. He smirked. If you do, make it look intentional. On the 3rd day a box arrived, inside a gown like no other. Midnight blue, threaded with tiny glass beads that shimmered like stars. A note was tucked inside. To make them look twice. W. Frances blinked at the letter, then smiled. Walter's way of encouraging her wasn't through flowery words, but in gestures, small and significant. That night she caught him standing by the balcony sipping wine alone. You hate these people, she said, joining him. I don't trust them, he corrected. They smile with knives behind their backs. Then why throw a ball for them? He looked at her. Because for once, I want the world to see you the way I do. Frances's breath caught. And then, before she could speak, he pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. And maybe, he added quietly, part of me is terrified of losing you. You won't, she whispered. The day of the ball arrived like thunder. Servants raced through the halls, musicians tuned their instruments, and the scent of lilies and candle wax filled the air. The great hall was transformed into a glowing vision of luxury, light, and anticipation. Frances stood before the mirror, dressed in the midnight blue gown, her hair pinned in soft waves with silver combs. Her heart beat wildly. You look like a star, said the maid softly. No, Frances whispered. Tonight I'm the storm. She descended the stairs just as the first guests arrived. The moment she entered the ballroom on Walter's arm, silence fell. Dozens of noble eyes turned to her, some curious, others judgmental. The air shifted. She smiled and curtsied. Duchess Frances, someone whispered. She's stunning. Throughout the night she danced with grace, held conversations with poise, and navigated veiled insults with wit sharper than most swords. You were born for this, one noblewoman told her in awe. She wasn't. But she chose to be. Walter watched her from across the room, pride flashing in his eyes. As the final waltz began, Walter approached her. May I have this dance, Duchess? Frances curtsied. Of course, Your Grace. He led her to the floor and they moved in perfect harmony, her hand in his, their eyes locked. Around them the court watched, not with disdain but wonder. And when the music slowed, Walter leaned in and whispered against her ear. You've won. She smiled. We did. The Duke of Evingale stepped forward at the end of the evening, nodding once. Consider the union recognized, he said, lips tight. But his gaze lingered on Frances with a hint of reluctant admiration. The hall burst into polite applause. But all Frances heard was Walter's quiet voice beside her. I never believed in fate, Frances. But I think you were always meant to rewrite my story. And as she looked into his eyes, no longer cold, but filled with something soft and vulnerable, Frances knew. The villain no longer stood alone. Chapter 10. Not the ending they expected. If this were still the novel, Frances would have been gone by now. Divorced. Banished. Forgotten. Instead, she stood beside Walter as Duchess of Blackmore, not just in name, but in heart. And the story? She had rewritten it line by line. The royal court, once whispering about scandal and disgrace, now spoke of the quiet strength of the villain's bride. Nobles who once sought to humiliate her now offered invites, alliance proposals, even praise. But Frances remained focused. Her goal was never just survival, it was love. The day after the ball, Walter surprised her with a ride through the countryside. No guards. No servants. Just the two of them on horseback, the morning mist curling around the cliffs. She laughed freely for the first time in days, the wind in her hair. I missed this, she said, pulling her horse beside his. Being away from court? No. Being with you. Without 100 people watching. He chuckled. You were magnificent last night. You sound surprised. I'm not, he said quietly. You've always been more than what the world expects. I just wish I hadn't spent so long pushing you away. Frances reached out and took his hand on the reins. I'm still here, aren't I? He stopped his horse and turned to her fully. I have something for you, he said. He pulled out a small box from his coat. Inside, a ring, not the family crest, not the Blackmore seal, but a simple band inlaid with a single sapphire. Not a symbol of duty, Walter said, voice hoarse. But one of choice. Frances blinked back tears. I choose you, Frances. Not because of an arrangement. Not because it's expected. But because you're the only person who ever saw me, not as a villain, not as a duke, but as a man. She laughed through her tears. Walter, that's so unfair. You're stealing my lines now. He slipped the ring onto her finger. Marry me, he said. For real this time. She leaned in and kissed him, soft and certain. I already did. That night, the skies over Blackmore lit up with stars. Frances stood by the balcony watching the world below. The same one that once tried to write her out of the story. Walter came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. Do you ever wonder, he murmured against her ear, what would have happened if you'd never ended up here? All the time, she whispered. But then I remember something important. What's that? I may have come from another world, but this is where I belong. And when Walter kissed her, slow and full of promise, Frances knew. The villain never needed saving. He just needed someone to believe he was worth loving. Epilogue. The tale they'll tell their children. The Duke and Duchess of Blackmore became something of a legend. They were a pair no one could have predicted. The villainous war hero and the mysterious woman who changed his fate. Bards sang their love story in taverns, and scholars debated whether Frances was a foreign noble, a forgotten royal, or some strange enchantress. None guessed the truth, that she was from another world entirely. But Frances didn't care. She had traded her old world for this one, and not once had she looked back. Years later, in the same garden where Walter first asked her to marry him, truly marry him, Frances sat on a bench holding the hand of a sleepy toddler nestled against her side. The little boy had Walter's gray eyes but Francis's impossible curiosity. He pointed at the flowers. "Mama," he mumbled. "Story, please." She smiled and brushed back his soft curls. "Which one, love?" "The one where the villain marries the princess." Francis laughed. "You mean the one where the villain falls in love with a girl from another world?" He nodded, eyes wide. "Well," she said, "once upon a time there was a man everyone feared. He was cold, cruel, and sharp as a sword. They called him the villain. But one day a girl arrived who wasn't afraid of him. She didn't run away. She stayed. And little by little, he started to believe he could be loved. And then they got married?" "They did," Francis said. "Even though it wasn't part of the plan. Even though everyone said it wouldn't work. They loved each other anyway. And he stopped being bad?" Francis looked up as footsteps approached. Walter, older and gentler, knelt beside the bench and scooped their son into his arms. "I never stopped being bad," Walter said with a mock growl. "Ask your mother about the time I threatened a royal envoy with a fork." "Walter," Francis groaned, laughing. The boy giggled. "You're not bad. You're Daddy." Walter leaned in and kissed Francis's temple. "And she's the reason I'm better." That night, Francis sat by the fire watching Walter read to their son, her heart full. She'd once feared this world. She'd once begged the stars to take her back. But now, this was home. Not because it was perfect, but because she had chosen to stay and had been loved for exactly who she was. And if someone ever wrote this story down, she hoped they'd remember this. The villain didn't change because of magic or fate. He changed because someone believed he could. And in the end, that was the most powerful rewrite of all.